Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic: explore Glacier and Waterton National Parks. Presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Jake Richards. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Over to you, Jake.
Awesome. Thanks, Rob. Hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. And let's make sure everything's working here. So, yeah, welcome everybody to Natural Habitat Adventures Know Before You Go presentation on our Glacier and Waterton adventure. Um, I've done a few of these, and I'm sure some of you have watched a few of these. So, you may know that these Know Before You Go webinars focus a little bit more on the nuts and bolts of the trip, some of the logistics. And I'll do some high level interpretation of some of the things that we're going to see on this trip. But if you want to dive deeper on some of those natural history topics, I definitely recommend checking out some of our other daily dose of nature webinars. Or, of course, the best way to do it is to come along on a trip. So let's get started. Let me introduce myself. So again, my name is Jake Richards. I grew up in Vermont, where I spent the first 30 years of my life. This is where I got a degree in history and then became a forklift driver. Did that for about a decade. And then I went back to school for environmental science. And that's when I learned about Teton Science Schools. And when I got into their graduate program, I moved out west, had the incredible opportunity to live in Grand Teton National Park for a little while, and did a lot of environmental education programs in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. I moved down to Logan, Utah to finish my master's degree at Utah State University, and that is where I now call home. And I've been here for several years now. And this is my fourth year with NatHab, Natural Habitat Adventures, and I've had the opportunity to guide most of our national park itineraries. So I'm currently the lead guide for our Glacier itinerary as well as our Yellowstone trips. And so I spend a lot of my time right here in the Rockies. So here's a quick overview of what I'll be covering in this presentation. I'll start off just talking about why I love this place so much. I'll do a little bit about the geography and some of the history of this place, and then I'll get right into those logistics, talking about lodging, transportation, food, and then kind of walking through our itinerary, our schedule. And then finally, I'll talk about what gear you should pack, what things you should bring, and then I'll close with a few photos of the wildlife that we hope to see on this trip. I also want to mention that all the photos in this presentation were taken by mostly by me or one of my co-guides on the places or in the places that we go on this trip, including this beautiful shot on the shores of Lake McDonald, which is where we spend our second night of the trip. And then a couple more housekeeping things. I often refer to Natural Habitat Adventures as NatHab. You're probably familiar with that, but that's what I'll probably be using that language throughout the trip. I'll also be kind of referring to this entire trip as our Glacier trip, even though we go to more places than just Glacier. We go to Waterton National Park, Badger Two Medicine National Forest, but I'll just kind of, for simplicity's sake, be referring to it as our Glacier trip. So if you have been on a trip with me before, which I'm sure a lot of you have, I can guarantee that Glacier has come up in conversation at some point. And that's because it's my number one favorite national park, and here's why. I've had the incredible privilege of guiding in places with just amazing wildlife, incredible biodiversity, places like Yellowstone, the Florida Everglades. And then I've also had the opportunity to guide in places that have just stunning landscapes, like the Grand Canyon, like Yosemite. The reason why I love this place so much is that it has both. As you can see from this photo, this is taken from the Prince of Wales Hotel where we get to stay for a couple of nights, and the landscapes are just incredibly majestic. The wildlife is abundant. All the Rocky Mountain species that you see in places like Yellowstone are also up in this ecosystem. This place is called the crown of the continent ecosystem, for a number of different reasons, but one of them is just because it is truly breathtaking. So where is this place? It is right on the border of northwest Montana and Canada, Alberta. And because Waterton Lakes National Park and Glacier National Park are adjacent to each other, they are collectively known as the Waterton Glacier International Peace Park. And that's a really unique relationship. It was the first international peace park to be created. And what that means is those two parks team up. They do a lot of management and research together because, again, these ecosystems contain natural communities, they contain wildlife that do not adhere to man-made boundaries, as you can imagine. So this is where we're going to be for the entire trip, in the crown of the continent ecosystem, right on the border of northwest Montana and southwest Alberta. So the ecological history of this place, very complex. Fortunately, we have 9 days. This is a 9-day trip. We get a lot of time to unpack a lot of that complexity. And so this is going to be very brief and very basic. As we travel through the ecosystem, we're going to see two very prominent visible forces on the landscape: ice and fire. It's kind of an overused trope at this point, but it's very accurate for some of these landscapes. Glacier actually doesn't get its name from the glaciers that exist within the park, but how the landscape has been shaped by glaciers, over millennia. The glaciers in this area created kind of the iconic U-shaped valleys throughout the park, as well as, those sharp, jagged mountain peaks and arêtes like you'll see in many of these photos. So there are glaciers still in the park that we'll be able to see, and those glaciers do also have an impact on the landscape, specifically the hydrology, the watersheds, the lakes and rivers. If you've seen photos of these areas or you've been able to visit them, that the water is just this beautiful aquamarine color. It's kind of an icon of glaciated areas, and this comes from what's called glacial silt or rock flour, as the glaciers are grinding a lot of the sedimentary rock that exists throughout this place. Those particles filter down into the water, into the streams and the rivers and the lakes, and give it that beautiful aquamarine color. The other really big influence on the landscape is wildfire, and we're going to hike through some burned areas. We're going to talk a lot about how important wildfires are to this landscape and the plants and the animals, all the organisms that have adapted to thrive in this place. Many of them are adapted to wildfires, and it creates really interesting, unique landscapes like you can see in this photo on the left. The juxtaposition of the beautiful fireweed, these pink flowers that have adapted to germinate immediately after a fire comes through, and you kind of get that contrast of all this new life growing up, among these standing dead trees, and just really incredible landscapes. Another very important part of the story of this place is the human history. Humans have lived on this landscape for thousands of years. Archaeological evidence puts people in this area about 11,000 to 13,000 years ago, about the end of the last ice age. But the Blackfeet oral tradition, they're one of the indigenous groups in the area. This is where their origin story takes place. They have been here, since time immemorial. The primary indigenous groups that lived in this area are the Kootenai on the west side of the Continental Divide and the Blackfeet to the east. And there were other groups, other tribes that kind of seasonally traveled through the area, but these two groups were kind of the primary resident groups in the area. And there's an excellent book I always like to recommend. This is called People Before the Park, and You can see actually the the cover photo is very similar to the photo I have on the slide there. Um, and this book's really interesting because the way it tells the story of these two people groups is phenologically or seasonally. So you can see what they were doing at different times of the year. So if you're coming to this area, say in July or August, it's really interesting to, if you have a copy of this book, to see what were those people doing in July and August. You know, what were the food sources? What were the animals doing? So it's a really neat way to start building that connection with this place, which is really the goal of these trips. That's at least my goal as a guide. Um, this photo that I have up is my favorite location on this trip. It's called Running Eagle Falls, and it was named after a woman who was one of the greatest Blackfeet warriors who ever lived. And you know, it's an incredible story, and I feel very honored to share that story. Um, and that kind of brings me into um, another topic I just want to point out is that one mistake that we often make when we're traveling through these areas is we talk about the indigenous groups in the past tense. Um, you know, and that's a mistake. They are still here. They still use this landscape, and we have the privilege of going on a hike with a Blackfeet guide, you know, on land that has great cultural and historical importance, you know, to their people. This is Alger. He's one of the Blackfeet guides that we get to spend some time with. Um, and it's really an invaluable part of this trip that a lot of folks who visit Glacier, you know, they don't get that perspective, and it's a very important perspective. So, in addition to the indigenous history, you know, much of the history of the national parks, you know, revolves around the white colonial history. You know, that's also a very significant part of the story. And in the American West, you can't talk about that story without talking about the railroads. And so that leads us into talking about our accommodations because um, many of our accommodations are in these historic lodges. You know, this photo is actually taken from the train station looking across the road to Glacier Park Lodge. And, you know, these historic lodges, they're located throughout the park. They're a big part of the history of both the national park and the railroad. Those two things are linked in this story because the railroad had a huge influence on Glacier becoming a national park and bringing people to this area and creating that infrastructure that allowed people to visit this place. You know, the Great Northern Railway was led by James Hill and his son Louis Hill. You know, and they were kind of instrumental in creating access to, you know, this area. The railway that they created was called the Empire Builder, and they kind of created this empire of towns and ranches, hotels, you know, roads, basically all the way from St. Paul to Seattle. And so, you know, we get to see evidence of that part of the story very personally. We get to stay in a lot of those lodges, and you know, these lodges are historic, and for better or for worse, you know, they're beautiful, they're incredible, but they are quite rustic. You know, some of them are going to be missing certain modern amenities that we've grown used to, like elevators and air conditioning. You know, large bathrooms. You know, the Wi-Fi sometimes is not, you know, the fastest, but you know, they're all part of that adventure experience. You know, they're part of the history of this place. You know, and they are just not only are they beautiful on their own, but they give us the best access to the places we want to be and the places where we're gonna look for wildlife and we're gonna explore. So definitely. Any of you know, their quirks are far outweighed by the benefits that they provide for us. So let's talk about rule number 2. Everybody gets a window seat. So we limit our groups to fewer than 14 guests. We take 2 vans, we have 2 guides. So everybody gets a lot of space in these vehicles, get excellent views of the landscapes, the wildlife. You know, we have Mercedes Sprinter vans, these safari vehicles, which are, you know, specifically equipped for these types of trips. And, you know, you can see they have things like roof hatches, which come in quite handy for some of the wildlife encounters that we sometimes have on these trips, like this one from a couple seasons ago, this black bear up in Waterton. Um, We do cover quite a bit of territory on this trip, but we've designed our stops and where we stay in such a way that we're not doing extended drives. Most of our drives are I think our longest drive is hour to an hour and a half. So we're not doing, we're not spending, entire days or half days on the road. We try to break up the trip in such a way so we're keeping those drives short so we can spend more time, exploring the place and not just getting from point A to point B. Another thing to point out, we do take quite a few boats on this trip, which some people find quite surprising. They're primarily historic boats that get us to trailheads or, our scenic trips across the lake that we'll be looking for wildlife. They are not boats that we take to get from one destination to another to get us to our lodging or anything like that. So if people want to opt out, if boats aren't your thing, those are optional activities, but they are one of the best ways to access a lot of areas, and they're usually a highlight for guests on this trip. But I usually like to just mention that because people don't usually go to Glacier for the boat travel. So, anybody know rule number one? Rule number one is you will never go hungry on a NatHab trip. So on this itinerary, we have a mix of field meals, local restaurants. We'll eat at the historic lodges, and if you've been on a NatHab trip, you always know we have lots and lots of really good snacks. So you'll never go hungry. A lot of our lunches are going to be field lunches provided by our partners that we'll be eating, out in the field, out on the trail, which, I love and a lot of our guests love because it allows us to spend more time, out in this beautiful place, out looking for wildlife. And we do work very closely with all of our partners to ensure that all dietary needs are met. So make sure if you have dietary needs and preferences, you communicate that to NatHab before the start of the trip. That way we can get that information to our partners and we can take care of you all. So let's take a few minutes to kind of walk through our itinerary. And again, you don't need to keep track of all this. This is information that when you come on a trip, we'll be communicating to you, but this is going to give you an overview of the 9 days that we're going to spend together. So day one is arrival day. You'll be flying into the town of Kalispell, Montana. It's got about 30,000 people, so it's a relatively small airport. If you arrive on day one, you're going to be picked up by one of your guides, one of your expedition leaders, and it's about a 20-minute drive to our hotel in Whitefish, Montana, a nearby town. If you do arrive a day or two early, just make sure that you'll have to set up your own transportation from the airport. And the hotel that we stay at, the Firebrand, they do have a shuttle, so you can just give them a call to arrange that pickup. Whitefish is a fun little town, about 9,000 people, a little ski resort town. You can see the ski mountain in the background of this slide here. Really fun town to spend an extra day or two if you do want to get in a little early. There's a lake and a river, within walking distance of downtown. Cool little bookstore, a little co-op, just really fun town. So if you do want to come in early and spend a day or two, it's a great place to do it. Really beautiful spot. That evening of day one, you will, when you check into the hotel, you'll get a welcome letter that'll give you some details about when and where we are going to meet up. But the plan is we will do an orientation at the hotel and then a short drive, just like a 5-minute drive to a wonderful country club restaurant where we'll have a nice welcome dinner as a group that evening. And then we will get ready for our first full day together, which is day two. So after breakfast, we're gonna take a scenic float on the Flathead River. And so if you look at Glacier National Park on a map, it's kind of a U shape. And the boundaries of the park, the west boundary of the park is the North Fork of the Flathead River. The southern boundary of the park is the Middle Fork of the Flathead River. And then the eastern boundary of the park is the Blackfeet Indian Reservation. So our scenic float is going to be on that southern portion, the Middle Fork, the Flathead River. So we get a really good glimpse, kind of an introduction to some of the mountains, some of the flora and fauna, birds, trees. And that's kind of how we'll start our trip, is with that scenic float. We'll have a little lunch, and then we will, in the afternoon, be taking a historic red bus ride, like the red bus there in the photo. We get a private red bus, so it's just our group, and we take a cruise up the west side of the park on going to the Sun Road. And going to the Sun Road is one of the highlights of the trip. Really, it's a highlight for most people to visit the park. If you talk to people about, if you've been to Glacier, they'll be like, oh yeah, we went up the Sun Road or whatever it's called. Going to the Sun Road is just it's incredible. One of the best drives in North America. It was an engineering feat completed in 1932. Cuts up through the mountains, up over the Continental Divide. Really, the only way to access kind of the heart of Glacier National Park. So we'll explore the west side on that bus tour. We'll come back down to spend the night at Lake McDonald Lodge. I'm going to take a quick drink of water here. So on day 3, we'll be on the west side of the park. And so we'll do a morning hike on the west side. And one really unique thing about Glacier National Park is the differences between the west side of the park and the east side of the park. Because the way that the topography and the weather systems interact, they kind of create some really interesting and unique conditions for different species and different habitats. In fact, on the west side of the park, there's actually temperate rainforests. So that's one thing we'll be talking about and exploring. When we get over to the east side, for a number of reasons, it's much drier. There are certain species that only grow on the west side of the park, and they don't grow on the east side, and we'll kind of talk about some of those. And on the east side, we're going to do a hike, in the afternoon, we're going to do a hike on the east side. So within a single day, we're going to see some of those comparisons. That evening, we're going to head north to the Many Glacier Hotel, which is the hotel in this photo here, right on the shore of Swift Current Lake. And we'll be spending 2 nights at the Many Glacier Hotel. A really beautiful spot. The guides on this trip, we always kind of have a debate which place we like better, which spot is more beautiful, the Many Glacier Hotel or the Prince of Wales Hotel. And you'll see why with some of the upcoming photos. The next day, day 4, since we're spending 2 nights at the Many Glacier Hotel, we can spend the whole day exploring this area. And so in the morning, we take a couple of boats, including the Morning Eagle, this historic boat here. We take a boat ride, short walk, another boat ride, and then we have about a 2-mile hike up to a beautiful glacial lake. Again, looking for wildlife the whole time, beautiful scenery the whole time. And then we usually do lunch out in the field that day. And then the afternoon, we do have some options. If folks want to do some more hiking, we have options to do some hiking with your guides. But again, going back to that photo of the hotel, it is also a beautiful place to just spend the afternoon, either at the lodge or on the shore of the lake. There's wildlife pretty much, we've seen bears and moose and lots of wildlife right from the hotel. So again, if you're interested in doing more hiking, that's an option. If you want to, have a slightly more relaxing vacation, this is a good place to grab a book and enjoy the scenery. So that evening, we'll have some dinner. And then the next morning, we make our way north to Canada. And so this is the Prince of Wales Hotel. As you can see, vying for top spot as far as most beautiful location on the trip. And again, we spend 2 nights at the Prince of Wales Hotel, which means we get a lot of time to explore this area. And this area is prime bear habitat. So, one of the reasons why I like guiding this trip, and a lot of folks like going on these trips is looking for bears. And so a lot of our time in the Waterton area is going to be looking for those animals. Obviously, no guarantees with wildlife, but some of our best bear sightings are in the areas surrounding Waterton. Okay. So day 6, like I said, we're going to spend 2 nights at Prince of Wales Hotel, which means we have a full day to explore this area, the Waterton Lakes region. So we have expert guide partners through Tamarack Outfitters. They're going to take us out. We have a couple different hiking options, but we're going to learn a lot about this place. And again, its history. We're going to be looking for wildlife. And just like Many Glacier, we have hiking options in the morning. We have a few different options in the afternoon if folks want to explore the town on their own. Everything's very close within walking distance. Um, but in the evening, right before dinner, we take another boat ride. We go all the way down to the end of Upper Waterton Lake, and we actually go across the border again. So we start in Canada, we head south into the United States to a place called Goat Haunt. And this is a really, really cool place because it's only accessible either on this boat or through the backcountry, through trails. And for folks, especially for folks that have the national park passport books, this is a good spot to get a stamp because again, it's very difficult to get to. Not a lot of people go to goat hunt, and really cool addition to this trip. It's a really neat place. We usually see some wildlife either there on the way there, and it's just a fun experience all around. All right, day 7. So we're going to go for a short hike in the morning, again with our local guides to a beautiful spot. We have a couple different options, but we usually like to go to Cameron Lake, look for bears. Sometimes we go to Acamina Lake, look for moose. And then we make our way south. We head back down into the United States. And this afternoon, we do a hike called the Hidden Lake Overlook Trail up at Logan Pass. This is one of the more challenging hikes on this trip. A lot of it is on a boardwalk, but it does gain some elevation. So there's some stairs, some wooden stairs that we have to go up. But it really is another highlight of the trip. And the reason why is because we are in the high alpine, this whole time. So we're looking for alpine wildflowers. The peaks are jagged and imposing, like right over your head. And we're going to be looking for species that spend their time primarily above tree line, like the mountain goat, bighorn sheep, pikas we sometimes see up there. So there are certain species that have adapted to high alpine areas, and we get to hike in a high alpine area, which is really, really cool, really a highlight. I know if you come on our Yellowstone trips, we see a lot of these species, like the goats and the bighorn sheep. Sometimes it's from a long ways off because those high alpine areas are, the tops of mountains. But this is an opportunity to go for a hike in those areas and hopefully see some of those organisms up close. Then we're going to head to East Glacier Park, again on the east side of the park, spend 2 nights there, which will set us up for day 8. Which again, I keep talking about highlights of this trip. You can tell I'm getting excited to be up there. I'll be headed up in about a week because there's so many pieces of this itinerary that I really love. And day 8 includes a couple of them. We take another historic boat ride, which you can see the Cinnapaw right here, and we travel across Two Medicine Lake. This whole area is a very sacred space to the Blackfeet. A lot of wildlife in this area, so we'll be looking for animals on that boat ride. And we get to spend the afternoon with our Blackfeet guides. This includes a kind of a cultural presentation where we learn about their spirituality, their history, their culture, and then we get to go for a hike with them as well. And so we learn more about some of the politics about national forest versus reservation land versus national parks. We get to talk about, the history of that relationship, and we get to learn about the relationship of these people with the land. And again, I think for me as a guide, that's really what these trips are about. It's about building that relationship with the land, this connection to place, that ties us together with some of these incredible places we get to travel. And that evening, we'll have our farewell dinner. This is our last full day together, so we'll be eating at a place called Summit Mountain Lodge. Wonderful food. They have one of my favorite desserts on any national park trip. And then the following day, day 9, is our final day. That is departure day. So we'll be leaving East Glacier Park. We'll head back towards Kalispell and Whitefish. Make sure we get folks where they need to be, in time for their flights or whatever travel arrangements they've made. We do have some wildlife stops on that route back to town, so we'll be continuing to look for animals even on day 9. And that's where we'll say our goodbyes, either at the airport or we'll bring folks back to the Firebrand in Whitefish, if you have other travel arrangements or you're staying in town for a little bit longer. So that is our trip, day 9. That's 9 very full days of adventure. So let's talk about gear. What should you pack? What should you bring? You can see that the first thing I have on the list is good shoes. We do quite a bit of hiking. If you haven't figured that out, this is, at least a moderate trip. We do hiking pretty much every day. Sometimes for folks that want to do more hiking, we can do 2 hikes a day. So having good shoes is really important. Other than that one boardwalk hike that I was talking about, it's primarily on trail, meaning uneven terrain, some rocks and roots, and like you can see in these photos. I also just want to recommend break in those shoes before you come on the trip. You can buy the nicest shoes that money can buy, but if you're not used to them, if they're not broken in, sometimes that can create some unpleasant experiences on a trip. If you're having sore feet or blisters, so make sure those shoes are broken in and they're comfortable, and you're prepared to be out in the wild for a few hikes on this trip. Water, very important. NetHab, I believe, sends water bottles to you all. Make sure you bring those because, again, a lot of hiking. Sometimes those summer days are going to be hot, and we are going to be, at elevation for most of this trip. I think most of the trip is between 3,500 feet and 7,000 feet. And so staying hydrated is really important, especially if you're coming from sea level, and that helps mitigate any of those unpleasant side effects of elevation that some folks feel. Sun protection is very important. We do provide sunscreen, but like you can see in these photos, it's always good to have a sun hat. Bring some light long sleeve sun shirts, because again, high elevation sun can really sap your energy pretty quick if you're not prepared for it. Optics, if you want to bring binoculars, you are welcome to. However, you do not need to. We provide binoculars for every guest on every trip, so you don't feel like you need to bring binoculars unless you have a pair that you really like and you want to use. We also have scopes that we provide for looking at wildlife. And then camera. Feel free to bring your camera. A lot of folks use their phone. Phones take great photos. And your guides will be bringing their cameras. A lot of other guests bring their cameras as well. And this brings up a really cool feature of NatHab Trips, which is our photo sharing platform on the Adventure portal. And we've had great success with this over the last year and a half or so. I think we've been using it, where all of us that go on the trip together, both guides and guests, we all have a way of sharing our photos with each other. And what that means is it really contributes to the quality of these trips, because it means that you don't have to focus on taking a photo of every single thing you see every single day. There's going to be 10 to 15 of us taking photos throughout the day. Like I said, a lot of your guides are going to be bringing their cameras and taking really great shots and sharing those with you. And so it's a way for folks to go on these trips and to really be present and really enjoy these experiences without that kind of that push or that fear, like, oh, I need to document every single thing that I see, because we get to share those photos with each other at the end of the trip. Passport is very important. We cross the border twice. We go up into Canada and then we come back to the United States. So make sure you bring your passport with you. And then finally, the last item I have on here is layers. And you can see that I've put 3 different things: winter clothes, summer clothes, and rain gear. And you might think, if I'm going in July, I don't need to bring winter clothes, warm layers. But let me put up this next slide, and you can see that the average temperatures in West Glacier, on the west side of the park where we start the trip, lows can be, 40s. Again, these are averages. So lows can be in the 30s. Highs can be 70s or 80s. So keep in mind, it's not uncommon to see a 40-degree swing from when we get up and get started in the morning to the heat of the day. So packing layers that you can take on and off throughout the day as those temperatures change is really important. And we're also going to be up in the mountains, and mountain weather is extremely unpredictable. Wind and rain and storm fronts can kind of come through without much notice. So making sure you have rain layers with you every day is also very important. Um, I usually bring a pair of gloves, even though it's a summer trip. Good thing to have for those cooler mornings. But yeah, bringing layers is really important. And if you have more questions about gear, I'm happy to answer those. Photography. So, a couple things about photography on these trips. Number one, we do have photography departures, which means we do have a 9-day Glacier Waterton trip that is focused on photography. We have expert photo guides that go on these trips. They'll teach you, about your camera, about getting the shot, about composition. They're designed for photographers. I've been able to guide some of those in the past, and they're a lot of fun. Slightly different focus, usually earlier mornings to get that golden hour light. If you're interested in those, talk to your adventure specialists, and they can answer more of your questions about those photography departures. But even if you're going on our regular wildlife departures, again, I think all or most of our guides in Glacier are photographers or photo enthusiasts, and we're going to be taking photos throughout the trip. We're going to be bringing our cameras. I got mine sitting right here. And again, we're going to be sharing those photos with you at the end of the trip. If you are bringing a camera, I will say this can be a challenging itinerary to pack for very good reasons, and that's because we have such a wide range of subjects on this trip. From alpine wildflowers, which make for great macro photography shots. Obviously wildlife, good to have a telephoto lens. And just the stunning landscapes, the vistas. Great landscape photography as well. I usually bring two lenses, an 18 to 135, for landscapes and portraits, and then my 70 to 350 telephoto. Again, if that means nothing to you, don't worry about it. Just throwing that out there for folks that do want to bring their cameras, so they know what lenses might come in handy. All right. My last few slides here are wildlife. I'm going to go through some shots of animals that we hope to see on our Glacier Waterton trip. And after these photos, I'll open it up to some questions. So black bears are, they're around, they're up there. We want to keep our distance from wildlife a safe distance, especially animals like bears that we want to see on these trips. So we have things like scopes, and we have the roof hatches. Like, we have all the tools necessary to get incredible views of some of these carnivores, omnivores like these bears. And one great thing about Glacier Waterton National Parks, really, it's it's a great conservation success story, because it's what we call an intact ecosystem. And that means that it has all of the large carnivores and predators and animals that existed here prior to European settlement in the area. We wiped out a lot of carnivores through a lot of the United States in the early 20th century, 19th and 20th century. But fortunately, World Wildlife Fund and other conservation organizations, have made efforts to restore a lot of these species. And in places like Glacier, we get to see some of these success stories. We get to see some of these species. We'll also be looking for moose, the old swamp donkey, like this one in Swift Current Lake. This was right near Many Glacier Hotel. Bighorn sheep, this is from that hike up at Logan Pass that I was talking about, up in the Alpine. You can see the Krumholtz, which is those gnarly trees in the background, that edge of tree line. And this is where a lot of those species, like bighorn sheep and mountain goats and a few others, like to spend their time. So bighorn sheep, one of those animals we'll be looking for up here at Logan Pass. This is a mule deer right at Upper Waterton Lake. And you can see that buck still has his antlers in velvet. The deer family lose their antlers every year, and they grow them back every year. And this time of year, June into July, A lot of times you can see those moose, those elk, those deer with their antlers in velvet, and it's a really cool sight to see. And then finally, the mountain goat. This is again a shot from one of our hikes up at Logan Pass with Bear Hat, the iconic Glacier National Park mountain in the background. And the mountain goat is just a real iconic species of Glacier National Park. And, it's one of those animals that we'll be looking for. And it's one of those animals that, I love to watch because they are incredibly uniquely adapted for the habitat and the terrain, where they feed and they forage and they have their kids. And so that's an experience that I hope to share with you all on this trip. And with that, I'm going to open it up to questions.
All right, thank you so much, Jake. Now, before we get into the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. All right, let's get to some questions. So, um, now let's talk about clothing, for instance. Is long underwear something I'm going to need on this trip?
Um, I don't usually bring long underwear on this trip. However, I usually bring rain pants. So if a morning is especially cold, I take advantage of that rain layer as like an extra insulating layer. Obviously, it's not like built for extremely cold winter conditions, but you can use like rain pants or rain jacket as that kind of extra layer for some of those chilly mornings. If you tend to run cold, they might come in handy. Usually they don't take up a ton of space. But I personally don't bring them, but I make sure I have enough other layers that, I'm prepared for those cold mornings.
Great, thank you so much. So, can you talk about how many guides will be on each trip and how many people will be in the group?
Sure. Yeah. So each trip has two guides, and we take two vehicles, and we usually have it's always fewer than 14 guests. It's usually between 10 and 14 guests. And what that means is the way that breaks things up is that we only have 7 people in each van, which means in a 12 passenger Sprinter van, everybody gets a window seat, everybody gets lots of space. And when we go on hikes, it's usually two guides with those 12 to 14 guests, but we usually have other guides as well, like our Blackfeet guides, Tamarack Outfitters in Canada. We have glacier guides. So when we're hiking on a trail, there might be 15 of us, but probably 3 or 4 of those people are going to be guides. So there's lots of personal attention, lots of questions being answered. It also allows us to you might have faster folks and slower folks that want to go farther. So we have a lot of flexibility because of the small group size.
Are there a lot of crowds besides our group when we go out into Glacier and Waterton?
Depends on where we go. As guides, we know the area really well. We know how to avoid a lot of those crowds. Logan Pass is usually pretty busy just because it's a beautiful spot. It's kind of an iconic spot within the park. But most of the other hikes that we go on, we'll be looking for places that are off the beaten path, out of the way, kind of spots where we know there are wildlife sightings. And, one of the great things about staying in those lodges is that it puts us in the heart of the park, in the mornings and evenings when those crowds are less. So we kind of avoid the busy trails during the busy times of day.
And how early will our day start?
Yeah, that's a great question. So most of our organized activities start after breakfast. So usually we have breakfast, and then after breakfast we have a hike, or that's when we depart for our next destination. We will throughout the trip have optional sunrise activities, and that'll either be as a group with your guide, or sometimes we will say like, hey, if you are an early bird, just go down the hill to the bridge. So usually we have optional early morning activities, and we're usually starting our big group activities after breakfast.
What is the hardest hike, and can you talk about the elevation? How high up are we getting?
Yeah, that would be the Hidden Lake Trail. Um, and that, ooh, I'd have to look up the numbers. I think it gains like 400 feet. It's about a 3 mile round trip, a little bit more, 3 point something. Again, I apologize, I don't have the numbers right in front of me. But keep in mind with all of these hikes, with the number of guides that we have supporting our group, um, we encourage folks to at least start the hike, because if you get tired or for any reason you want to turn back, we have the ability to make those adjustments while on trail. So again, we encourage folks to at least start out, because sometimes those bighorn sheep, we saw those within 100 yards of the start of the hike. So but yeah, that's our most difficult one. um, a lot of our other hikes, like the one with the Blackfeet guides, the one in Many Glacier, they might be a couple miles long, but they're usually not a lot of elevation. So the Hidden Lake one kind of has the most elevation, but no pain, no gain. It's also the most rewarding and beautiful spot. Um, one of the more beautiful spots, just because we're up in that high alpine environment. So.
Great. Thank you so much for answering that question. So, what about hiking poles? Am I going to need hiking poles on this trip, or are they available to me?
They are available. Yeah. So we have hiking poles or trekking poles that we bring with us. So you do not need to bring your own. We'll have those available. We usually have one available for each guest. That's kind of the number that we've kind of figured out usually meets everybody's needs. So if you know for a fact that you're going to need two, you could always bring one on your own. Or, a lot of times we do have enough hiking poles where you could use two. But yeah, we do provide those. We definitely will have at least one for every guest.
Is bear spray something you carry or something we need to worry about?
Yes and no. So yeah, we carry bear spray, and it's not something you need to worry about. Um, we're very well trained in guiding in bear habitat, and so that's why we're guides. That's why we're professionals. So, and another thing is that traveling in groups is always very safe. If you look at the statistics, they're bear encounters don't really occur with large groups. And so there's a number of different precautions that we take, because we do want to see these animals. It's a highlight for many guides to see large animals like bears. But we know what we're doing, and safety is always the number one priority. So we would never do anything that was unsafe for us or for the bears, because we do care about the wildlife as well, and we would never put either of those groups at risk.
Great to know. Thank you. Are there wolves or coyotes in Glacier?
Yes, and yes. uh, so I have never seen a wolf in Glacier. I'll just put that out there. There are not very many. They are in very remote parts of the park, and parts of Glacier where there are wolves tend to be very wooded, very thick, so it's easy for them to stay far away from humans. They do exist. It is always a goal of mine to see those animals. As we're going through the trip, you're probably going to hear me saying like, "Hey, you guys seen any wolves in the area recently?" Because it is a possibility. They do live up there, and but highly unlikely to see them. Coyotes, on the other hand, we do often see coyotes. There are quite a few around.
Great. Thank you so much. What about a mosquito net or a mosquito hat or a mosquito repellent? Are we going to deal with mosquitoes?
We are always prepared for that. We do have mosquito nets so you can put over your hat. We carry bug spray. You don't need to pack those on your own unless you really want to, but it's not usually an issue. It really depends on where we go. If there has been rain recently, there's a lot of factors, but they're usually not that bad. It's never been a significant issue, and again, we provide stuff for that.
Great. Thanks. Um, so is have there been wildfires or smoke this year? Are we doing okay?
I think we're doing okay. I haven't looked up if there's any. I know there's some happening in other parts of the country right now, but it's kind of early for wildfire season, and I'm not aware of any in Glacier right now. If there are any, they're very small. But you got to keep in mind, going to the Sun Road doesn't usually open until the end of June, and that's because of the snowpack. So, when we start our trips in late June, that's basically springtime. There's still snow on the ground up there, there's still a lot of water in the system. And so, usually, fires don't really, get going large scale across the American West until August, September, later in the season, because that's when things start to dry out, when that snowpack is kind of all dissipated.
So when we're on the boat trip, are rough waters something I'm going to have to worry about? Should I worry about being seasick?
No. Um, the most the Waterton Lake is the largest body of water that we take a boat on, and because it's a larger body of water, it's a larger boat, and so it's never real. It's not rough. These boats are built for that. And again, most of the smaller boats, like I showed in the pictures, the Cinnapaw, Morning Eagle, those are in smaller bodies of water that usually aren't even choppy. So that has not been an issue on my trips. We always buy Dramamine at the beginning of the season to have with us. And I think in the 4 years I've been doing it, I don't even think I've ever passed any out. So we're prepared for it, like we are with all safety or comfort issues, but it's never a big deal.
Great, thank you. So can you compare the wildlife viewing on this trip to, say, Yellowstone?
Yeah, we see a lot of the same species, but the sightings and the landscapes are very different. Um, so it's kind of like when you go to Yellowstone, your chances of seeing wolves are higher. Um, your chances of seeing grizzly bears are a little bit higher. Um, but on our glacier trip, things like mountain goats and bighorn sheep, because we're up in that high alpine, a lot of those sightings are, sometimes closer. Again, wildlife, I'm kind of trying to not set expectations unrealistically, but we see a lot of the same species, but we're in much different habitat. So the way that we see them, whether it's from a vehicle or from on foot, is always much different. Um, there is a lot more hiking on this trip, so just by the sheer amount of time that we spend off the road and in the backcountry means that more of our wildlife sightings on the glacier trip are on foot as opposed to from the vehicle, which if you've been on our Yellowstone trip, Yellowstone is huge. Yellowstone is twice the size of Glacier National Park, so we do a lot more wildlife viewing and exploring from the vehicle. So yeah, there's quite a few smaller changes, even though we're seeing a lot of the same species.
Is there a good opportunity or a better time to come if I really want to see the wildflowers?
Earlier is better. For wildflowers, I'm a big wildflower guy. That's what most of my tattoos are. Um, and yeah, earlier is usually better, just because throughout the Rocky Mountains things dry out. And so, fortunately, on this trip, because we do that Logan Pass hike up in the Alpine, we see wildflowers pretty much throughout the season. But I would say the most diversity is going to be earlier in the year. Once that snow melts, that's when things like glacier lilies pop out. You have a lot of like ephemeral species that try to be the first to grow once the snow melts, and so yeah, you'll get more diversity earlier in the season.
So when we're out and about hiking, am I going to have a restroom facility available to me, or what do we do?
Yeah. So the hikes that we go on, um, we are prepared for that because we always push the water. Stay hydrated, stay comfortable, um, and because of that, we do know where all the restrooms are. A couple of the hikes, they're going to be outhouses, basically. When we're going up to Grinnell Lake, there's a couple of spots there that it's an outhouse. Not gonna sugarcoat it, but we do have opportunities for restrooms. So and then obviously as we're driving around, trailheads, visitor centers, hotels, yes, there are plenty of restrooms.
And Can you talk about, just reiterate what the weight restrictions are for your luggage? And since there are some restrictions, will there be laundry available to us at some of the facilities?
Yeah, that's a great question. The weight restrictions, I definitely would refer you to the pre-departure briefing, which is a document that when you book the trip, it has a lot of those details. And a lot of that is because we're transferring luggage from hotel to hotel, but refer to the pre-departure briefing for that. And there are laundry services. Uh, I'd have to double check, but I know there's at least a couple of the lodges that have that. Again, I apologize, I don't have the specifics on that, but I as a guide, I'll be up there for extended periods of time, and so yes, I rely on laundry services as well, and so we do have those available.
Great to know. Thank you. So if I have some, let's say, older teenagers, is this an appropriate trip? Is there an age minimum to come on this trip?
I think NatHab has some numbers that they might give you. I want to say it's 12 years old, but don't quote me on that. I think this is a great trip for young people to come on. I've done a lot of environmental education with younger folks, teenagers, and so our guides are great at facilitating family groups, and it's a lot of fun. And I would just make sure that they like hiking, and because it's not um, we're going to be out getting after it. And, I know when I was that age, I loved hiking and I would have loved a trip like this. So, even in Yellowstone, we've had a few family groups lately where we've had some teenagers and some other young folks, and it's been a great time. So, yeah, I definitely recommend it. Glacier's incredible. Doesn't matter what age you are.
Sounds great. Thank you, Jake. Unfortunately, that will be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'd like to throw it back to you for your closing comments.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate, those of you that have gone on NatHab trips, I'm sure you have had those experiences where, like, wow, the wildlife in this spot is incredible. The scenery in this spot was, breathtaking. I talked to a lot of people that have gone to Yellowstone or have, explored the American national parks, and a lot of folks have not been to Glacier, and I think everybody should see Glacier. I think you should all come and see why it's my favorite national park.
Jake, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. If you're interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, please give us a call at the number on your screen, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.